They called her the janitor, because she cleaned up the messes the young Ivy League surgeons were too proud to touch. Dr. Sterling even bet $500 that Sloane Avery, with her gray bun and trembling hands, wouldn't survive a single shift at St. Jude's Elite Trauma Center. To them, she was a relic of a forgotten era. But the laughter died the moment the bay doors burst open and the most decorated Navy SEAL in history was wheeled in, dying. The elite surgeons swarmed him, but the commander didn't look at them. Through the haze of blood and agony, he locked eyes with the shaky nurse in the corner. Then, with his final ounce of strength, he ignored the chief of surgery and raised a trembling hand to his brow in a crisp, reverent salute. That salute didn't just save his life. It began the systematic destruction of every career in that room. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's didn't just illuminate, they judged. In a world of $400 scrubs and caffeine-fueled egos, Sloane Avery was an eyesore. At 52, she moved with a methodical, plodding pace that the residents mistook for slowness. While they sprinted, she observed. While they bragged, she remembered the smell of burning oil and the grit of desert sand, nightmares she hoped to drown in a quiet civilian pension. Check the expiration dates again, Grandma, Dr. Preston Sterling called out, winking at his clique. The son of a senator and the hospital's golden boy, Sterling treated the trauma unit like a private club. To him, Sloane's subtle hand tremor was a neon sign of incompetence, not the literal scar of a combat medic who had held chest cavities together under mortar fire. Sloane gripped a saline bag, her knuckles turning white as she endured the humiliation in silence. She had chosen invisibility. She had chosen the quiet. But as the mass casualty klaxon began to scream a code black, Sloane realized the universe was done letting her hide. The warrior, sleeping deep inside her, was about to wake up, and Dr. Sterling was about to find out that the woman he called a charity case was the only person in the building who knew how to stop a man from dying. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Elite Trauma Center did not just illuminate the room, they vibrated with a judgmental frequency that only Sloane Avery seemed to hear. At 52, she felt every hertz of that aggressive brightness in her bones. She stood by the stainless steel supply cart in Trauma Bay 4, her movements deliberate and methodically slow as she restocked the shelf with 14-gauge angiocatheters. To the casual observer passing by the glass-walled bay, she was a relic. A woman with steel-gray hair pulled back into a severe, unfashionable bun that looked more like a defensive knot than a hairstyle. Her navy blue scrubs were a size too large, effectively swallowing a frame that had once been lean muscle but now looked perpetually exhausted under the weight of an invisible burden. Sloane moved with a plodding pace that drove the younger, more vibrant staff to the brink of insanity. While the residents sprinted through the pristine corridors with the frantic, caffeinated energy of those who had never witnessed the true horror of a battlefield, Sloane moved like a person navigating a live minefield. She was obsessive. She checked the seal on every single gauze pack before placing it on the shelf. She verified the expiration dates on the saline bags 3 separate times, her lips moving silently as she read the small print. To the gods in white coats, who populated the upper echelons of St. Jude's hierarchy, this wasn't clinical diligence. It was the slow-motion decay of a career that had likely spent too long in a rural clinic putting bandages on scraped knees. Check the dates again, Grandma. We wouldn't want a malpractice lawsuit just because your memory is as thin as your hair. A voice cut through the sterile air, sharp and jagged with amusement. Dr. Preston Sterling stood at the central nursing station, leaning back against the high counter with the casual, practiced arrogance of a man who knew his father's name was etched into the granite of the hospital's donor wing. At 32, he was the chief resident, handsome in a way that felt predatory. He didn't bother to look up from his tablet as he spoke. Beside him, Brittany, a young nurse whose eyeliner was far more precise than her clinical notes, let out a high-pitched, performative giggle. "I checked them 10 minutes ago, doctor," Sloane replied, keeping her back to him. Her voice was raspy, carrying a low-frequency grit that sounded like she had spent a lifetime shouting over the deafening roar of helicopter rotors. Sterling finally looked up, his eyes scanning her figure with a clinical disdain he usually reserved for a botched suture. "Check them again," he commanded, his voice hardening. "I've seen your hands, Sloane. They're shaking so hard you're probably vibrating the labels into a blur. We can't have patients dying because our charity case forgot how to read. Dementia is a silent killer." The laughter that followed felt like shards of glass. It was true that Sloane's right hand possessed a faint, rhythmic tremor. To a cosmetic surgeon like Sterling, it was a glaring neon sign of incompetence, a red flag that suggested she shouldn't be trusted with a thermometer. He didn't see the scar tissue hidden beneath her long sleeves, the twisted remnants of a secondary blast in a Fallujah triage center. He didn't see the hands of the ghost medic, who had once held a femoral artery closed with her bare thumb for 40 minutes while mortar shells turned the night sky into a furnace. Sloane didn't respond. She simply gripped the cold plastic of a saline bag tighter until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. She forced the tremor into submission, channeling the adrenaline into the mundane task. She had only been at St. Jude's for 3 weeks, and in that time she had become the unit's designated janitor. She was assigned the double shifts nobody wanted, the vomit-stained linens, and the most menial restocking tasks that the elite residents felt were beneath their Ivy League degrees. "I heard she came from some dirt patch clinic in the Midwest," Dr. Cole whispered loudly to Brittany as Sloane walked past them to the supply closet. "Probably spent 30 years handing out lollipops. Now she thinks she can handle Tier 1 trauma? She's a liability." Sterling stood up, smoothing his pristine white coat. "I give her 48 hours. One real emergency, one massive hemorrhage where the blood hits the ceiling and she'll faint. Then we can finally get someone in here who belongs in the 21st century." Sloane kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The insults burned, but they were nothing compared to the phantom heat she felt on her skin whenever the hospital's heating vents kicked on. Sometimes the smell of industrial floor wax faded, replaced by the scent of burning JP8 fuel and the metallic tang of copper. She was here for the pension. She was here for the silence. She needed the quiet to keep the ghosts of the sand from screaming in her ears. She retreated to the cramped break room and poured a cup of stale coffee. It tasted like ash. She rubbed her right knee, which throbbed with a dull rhythmic ache that always flared before a storm. "Just keep your head down, Sloane," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. 2 more years. Stay invisible." She was an expert at being invisible. In the military they called her the ghost because she could move through a chaotic casualty collection point without making a sound, fixing what was broken before anyone realized she was there. Here she was a ghost for a different reason, a forgotten woman in a world that valued ego over experience. The silence of the break room was sudden and heavy. Sloane looked down at her shaking hand. It was perfectly steady now, as if her body sensed the shift in pressure before her mind did. She felt the electric charge of a looming catastrophe. Then the world broke. The klaxon didn't just ring, it screamed. It was the specific, haunting 2-tone alarm that sent a shiver through the building, the code black. "ETA 3 minutes, the intercom shrieked. "Surgical teams 1 through 4 to the bay. Special ops transport incoming. This is not a drill." The break room door swung open. The casual mockery was replaced by frantic chaos. Sterling was barking orders, his face pale. As Sloane stepped into the hallway, Sterling's eyes locked onto hers with pure vitriol. "Avery, stay out of the way," he spat. "Go clean the floors in the lobby. This isn't a flu clinic. These are heroes coming in, and I won't have you fumbling around them with those shaky hands." Sloane opened her mouth, but the sound of sirens drowned her out. The double doors of the ambulance bay were thrown open with a violent crash. The smell that flooded the room made every resident recoil. It wasn't just blood. It was the smell of cordite, scorched Kevlar, and high-velocity trauma, a smell Sloane Avery knew better than her own name. As the first gurney rattled toward them, the medics were screaming for air. And in the center of the chaos, a blood-soaked Navy SEAL gripped the edge of his stretcher, his eyes searching the room with a terrifying intensity, until they landed directly on the one woman the doctors had told to stay in the shadows. The chaotic symphony of St. Jude's reached a fever pitch the moment the gurney wheels hit the linoleum. The sheer violence of the entrance shattered the sterile, controlled atmosphere Dr. Sterling tried so desperately to cure it. It wasn't just the injured men who burst through the doors. It was an entourage of frantic flight medics, shouting paramedics, and 4 grim-faced military police officers who immediately fanned out to secure the perimeter of the trauma bay, their hands hovering near the sidearms holstered at their waists. This was no longer a civilian hospital. In the span of 10 seconds, Trauma Bay 1 had been annexed by the Department of Defense. "Clear the corridor. I want Bay 1 and 2 isolated now," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking slightly before he found his command register. He was running alongside the lead gurney, his white coat flying behind him like a cape. He looked energized, high on the proximity to valor, treating the dying men like trophies that would guarantee his fellowship. "Brittany, get the massive transfusion protocol initiated. O negative, uncrossed, 6 units. Move." Sloane was pushed back against the supply cabinets by the surge of bodies. She didn't fight the tide. She rode it, melting into the periphery where she could observe without being targeted. Her eyes, usually tired and hooded, were now razor-sharp, scanning the scene with a tactical precision that would have terrified the residents had they bothered to look at her. She clocked the details the doctors missed. The patients weren't wearing standard-issue Army fatigues. Their gear was sterile of rank insignia, their tactical vests were high-end and non-standard, and their boots were silent soles. This wasn't a National Guard transport accident. This was a Tier 1 asset extraction. A Black Ops unit. That explained the MPs guarding the doors and the menacing men in dark suits already arguing with the hospital administrator in the hallway. "Vitals are crashing," a flight medic screamed, his flight suit soaked to the elbows in dark venous blood. He was gripping the lead gurney, trying to keep pressure on a horrific abdominal wound. "We lost a pulse twice in transport. He's the unit commander. Do not lose him." "I've got him," Sterling announced, shoving the medic aside to take the head of the bed. "I'm the attending trauma surgeon. Step back and let the professionals work." Sloane watched Sterling's hands. They were steady, but they were moving too fast, driven by adrenaline rather than assessment. He was looking at the blood, the spectacular, horrified volume of it covering the commander's torso, but he wasn't looking at the patient. The room became a hive of frantic activity. Nurses were spiking bags of fluid, residents were cutting away the remaining shreds of the commander's tactical gear, and machines were screaming in discordant warnings. The air smelled of raw copper and heavy, nervous sweat. Sloane. The sharp bark of her name snapped her attention to the left. Dr. Cole was struggling with a second patient in Bay 2, a younger soldier with shrapnel embedded in his thigh. "Don't just stand there vibrating. Get me more lap pads and a thoracotomy tray. Now." Sloane moved instantly. She didn't run, she flowed. She grabbed the sterile packs from the warming cabinet, her movements efficient and devoid of wasted energy. As she handed the tray to Cole, she glanced at the soldier on the table. He was conscious, his eyes wide and feral, scanning the ceiling for threats. He was hyperventilating, his hands clawing at the restraints. "He's panicking," Sloane said, her voice low. "His heart rate is 160. You need to talk to him, doctor. He thinks he's still in the kill box. I need to stop the bleeding, not sing him a lullaby." Cole snapped, ripping the packaging open. "Get away from the sterile field, Avery. Go clean up the wrappers in Bay 1 before Sterling has an aneurysm." Sloane withdrew, her jaw set. She moved back toward the main event in Bay 1, where the situation was spiraling downward. The commander, a mountain of a man named Major Julian Blackwood, according to the bloody dog tags hanging from the bedside monitor, was fighting the anesthesia. Even half dead, his survival instinct was violent. He thrashed against the leather restraints, his muscles corded and straining, ripping the foreline out of his antecubital fossa. Blood sprayed across the pristine floor. "Hold him down," Sterling yelled, dodging the spray. "God damn it, someone sedate him. Push 20 of etomidate and 100 of succinylcholine. We need to intubate before he bleeds out." Brittany fumbled with the vials, her hands trembling. The sheer size of the man and the violence of his struggle were overwhelming her. Sloane stepped closer, drawn in by a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. She watched the monitor. The heart rate was skyrocketing, tachycardia at 140 beats per minute, but the blood pressure was narrowing dangerously, 80/50. The oxygen saturation alarm was blaring a steady, monotone flatline note, 82%. Sterling was fixated on the neck. There was a jagged laceration just above the clavicle, oozing dark blood. "It's a jugular nick," Sterling announced to the room, grabbing a clamp. "He's bleeding out from the neck. Clamp and ligation, then we intubate. Cole, get over here and assist." Sloane stopped. She froze, her eyes narrowing as she looked past the blood, past the chaos, and focused on the anatomy of the man's chest. She saw it. It was subtle, a slight, uneven rise and fall of the chest wall. The left side was lagging behind the right. And at the base of his throat, right where the trachea dipped into the sternal notch, there was a shift, a deviation. The major wasn't fighting because he was in pain. He was fighting because he was suffocating. "Dr. Sterling," Sloane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise with a strange, heavy authority that didn't belong to a nurse. Sterling ignored her. "Suction. I can't see the field." "Dr. Sterling," Sloane said again, taking a step into the sterile zone. "Stop the sedation." Sterling whipped his head around, his surgical mask splattered with a single drop of the major's blood. His eyes were wide with incredulity. Excuse me? Did the janitor just give me a medical order? Get out of my trauma bay, Avery. I'm trying to save a war hero and you're breathing my air. Look at the monitor, Preston, Sloan said, using his first name, stripping away the hierarchy in a single breath. Look at the pulse pressure. Look at the trachea. It's deviated to the right. Security, Sterling shouted, turning his back on her. Remove this woman from the floor immediately. The security guards at the door took a step forward, their hands reaching for Sloane's arms. But before they could touch her, the tone on the monitor changed. It went from a frantic beeping to a slow, dying drone. The major's thrashing stopped. His hand, which had been gripping the rail, went limp. He's coding. Brittany shrieked. Pulseless electrical activity. Sterling froze. The clamp in his hand hovered uselessly over the neck wound. He stared at the monitor, his Harvard education failing to process why a man with a simple neck lack was suddenly dead on his table. He blinked, the arrogance draining out of his face to be replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that he had no idea what to do next. Sloane didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for security. The invisible woman vanished, and the ghost medic stepped into the light. She lunged forward, not toward the door, but directly toward the instrument tray, her shaking hand snatching a 14-gauge angiocatheter with the speed of a striking cobra. The transfer from the EMS gurney to the trauma bed was less a medical procedure and more a wrestling match. Major Julian Blackwood was a mountain of a man, stripped to the waist, his torso a roadmap of lacerations and old scars. But it was the way he moved that terrified Sloane. He wasn't fighting the doctors, he was fighting the air itself. Every muscle in his neck was corded tight, straining against a weight that no one else could see. On my count. 1, 2, 3, lift. Sterling shouted, helping wrestle the dead weight of the soldier onto the sterile sheets. As the major landed, fresh blood sprayed from a jagged wound on the side of his neck. It was dark and steady, venous blood, alarming to look at but not immediately fatal. Yet it was all Dr. Sterling could see. It was the shiny object that captured his ego. It's a jugular tear, Sterling announced, his voice pitching up with the thrill of the theater. He's bleeding out. Clamp. I need a vascular clamp now. Brittany, suction the field. Sloane stood at the foot of the bed, her shaking hands still at her sides, her eyes scanning the patient with a cold, predatory focus. She saw what the golden boy missed. She watched the major's chest. It wasn't rising. His diaphragm was heaving, his abdominal muscles were spasms of effort, but the left side of his chest remained terrifyingly still, a locked cage of bone. The major's hand shot out, gripping Dr. Cole's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and rolling back, the universal primal look of a mammal drowning on dry land. Restrain him. Sterling barked, leaning over the neck wound with his clamp, oblivious to the fact that his patient was turning a dusky shade of blue. He's fighting the sedation. Push more etomidate. I can't stitch a moving target. He's not fighting the sedation, Sloane said, her voice cutting through the panic. It was low, raspy, and entirely devoid of the nervous grandmother persona she had curated for weeks. He's drowning. Sterling didn't even look up. I said suction, not commentary, Avery. If you can't handle the blood, go wait in the hall. Sloane took a step closer, violating the sterile perimeter. She looked directly at the major's throat. It was the telltale sign, the one that every combat medic learned to spot in the nightmares of basic training. The major's trachea, the windpipe, was no longer centered. It was being pushed violently to the right, shifted by a massive pocket of trapped air building up inside his chest cavity. Look at the deviation, Preston, Sloane said, dropping the doctor's title. His lung has collapsed. It's a tension pneumothorax. The air is crushing his heart. If you sedate him now, you kill him. The room went silent for a microsecond. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and impossible. A nurse didn't correct a surgeon. A janitor didn't diagnose a trauma. Sterling whipped his head around, his eyes wild with adrenaline and offense. Did you just call me by my first name? Get out. Security. Get this geriatric incompetence out of my trauma bay before I have her license revoked. He turned back to the neck, his ego sealing the major's fate. Intubate. Tube him now. But as the resident moved to slide the laryngoscope into the major's throat, the monitor let out a sound that stopped time. The frantic beeping slowed, dragged out into a long, mournful drone. The pressure in the major's chest had finally kinked the great vessels of his heart like a garden hose. BP is dumping. Brittany screamed. 60 over palp. He's coding. Sterling froze, the clamp hovering uselessly over a superficial bleed, while the man on the table began to die. Sloane looked at the 14-gauge needle on the tray, then at the frozen surgeon, and realized that permission was no longer part of the equation. The flatline tone was the only sound in the universe. It was a high-pitched, electronic scream that signaled the end of a life and the failure of a god. Dr. Sterling stood frozen, his hands hovering over the neck wound, his eyes wide and hollow. The arrogance that usually armored him had shattered, leaving behind a terrified child in a white coat who didn't know why his toy was broken. "He's gone," Brittany whispered, backing away from the table. "Time of death." "No," Sloane said. The word wasn't a plea, it was a detonation. Sloane didn't walk. She exploded from her stillness. The vibration in her hands vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal, hydraulic stability of a marksman. She didn't move like a grandmother with bad knees, she moved like a breach team hitting a door. In 2 strides, she crossed the distance between the supply cart and the trauma bed. Sterling, snapped out of his paralysis by the sudden movement, stepped into her path. His ego, desperate to regain control of the narrative, flared up one last time. "Get back, you crazy bee." He reached out to grab her shoulder, a clumsy, forceful attempt to shove her away. Was a mistake. Sloane didn't break stride. As Sterling's hand made contact, she didn't flinch. Instead, she dropped her center of gravity, pivoting her hips with a fluid, terrifying grace that no nursing school had ever taught. She caught his wrist, using his own forward momentum against him, and drove her shoulder into his sternum. It wasn't a push, it was a tactical check, a calculated transfer of kinetic energy designed to clear a hostile from the kill zone. Sterling flew backward. He hit the instrument tray with a deafening crash of steel on steel, stumbling over his own expensive loafers before landing hard on the linoleum. The room gasped. Sloane didn't look at him. She was already at the bedside. She ripped the angiocatheter wrapper open with her teeth, spitting the paper onto the floor. Her left hand moved to the major's chest, her fingers pressing into the flesh, seeking the landmarks she could find in the pitch black of a cave. Clavicle. Mid-clavicular line. Second intercostal space. "What are you doing?" Dr. Cole screamed, paralyzed by the violence of the moment. "You can't." Sloane ignored him. She looked at the major's blue lips, at the veins distended like ropes in his neck. She positioned the 3-inch, 14-gauge needle against the skin. "Forgive me, Major," she whispered. She drove the needle down. There was a sickening pop as the steel punched through the skin and the intercostal muscle, followed by the crunch of the parietal pleura. Sloane didn't hesitate. She advanced the catheter all the way to the hub. The sound was unmistakable. It was loud, angry, and violent, the sound of pressurized air escaping a tire. It screamed out of the major's chest, carrying with it a fine mist of blood. The effect was instantaneous. The crushing pressure inside the thoracic cavity released. The major's heart, no longer strangled by the trapped air, surged. He took a jagged, gasping breath, a desperate, heaving inhalation that sounded like a saw cutting through wood. On the monitor, the flat line stuttered. A single spike, then another, then a rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Sinus rhythm. The anesthesiologist breathed, staring at the screen as if witnessing a resurrection. Oxygen saturation is climbing. 80, 85, 90. The color began to flood back into Major Blackwood's face, turning the deathly gray into a flushed pink. His chest rose and fell, deeper this time, the left side finally moving in sync with the right. Sloane pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place, and taped it down with a swift, practiced motion. She checked his pupils. They were reacting. He was back. The room was absolutely silent. The frantic energy of the code black had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, heavy vacuum. Every eye was fixed on the 52-year-old janitor, standing over the patient, her hands steady, her posture erect, her face a mask of cold, professional detachment. Then a sound broke the silence. "You." Sterling pulled himself up from the floor, his face red with humiliation and rage. His white coat was smeared with dirt from the floor, his perfect hair disheveled. He pointed a shaking finger at Sloane. "You assaulted an attending physician," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "You performed an invasive surgical procedure without a license. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Sloane turned to face him. The adrenaline was fading, and the cold reality was rushing in to fill the void. She saw the security guards pushing through the doors, their hands on their belts. She saw the hospital administrator, face purple with apoplexy, storming toward her. She had saved the hero. But she knew with absolute certainty that she had just destroyed herself. "I know exactly what I did," Sloane said quietly, stripping off her bloody gloves. Sterling smiled, a cruel, jagged thing. "Get her out of here. And call the police. I want her charged." As the heavy hands of the security guards clamped onto her shoulders, Sloane didn't fight. She looked back one last time at the bed. Major Julian Blackwood's eyes were open. He wasn't looking at the doctors saving him. He was looking at her. And in his gaze there was no confusion, only a dawning, dangerous recognition. The grip on Sloane's arm wasn't gentle. It was the firm, performative grasp of a security guard who had finally found an excuse to use his authority. Sloane didn't resist. She let her body go slack, a technique she had mastered decades ago during SEER training to conserve energy during capture. But this wasn't an enemy compound. It was the hallway of a hospital she had just sanctified with a miracle. "Get her to the administrator's office," Dr. Sterling shouted, his voice echoing off the tile walls. He was following them, wiping a smudge of dirt from his white coat with a trembling hand. "I want witnesses. She is a danger to every patient in this building." The trauma bay doors swung shut behind them, sealing away the steady, rhythmic beep of Major Blackwood's heart monitor, the only evidence that Sloane Avery existed. They didn't make it to an office. Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, met them in the corridor, flanked by legal counsel. Henderson was a man who viewed medicine through the lens of liability insurance, and the sight of his chief resident disheveled and shouting was his worst nightmare. "What is going on here?" Henderson demanded, blocking the path. "She assaulted me," Sterling spat, pointing a finger at Sloane that shook with adrenaline. "I was stabilizing the patient, preparing to intubate, and this janitor tackled me. She physically threw me across the room and then stabbed the patient in the chest with a 14-gauge needle without a sterile field, without anesthesia, and without an order." Sloane stood silent. She watched Henderson's face turn a shade of pale usually reserved for corpses. She knew how this sounded. In the civilian world, procedure was God. Results were secondary. "Ms. Avery," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Is this true? Did you strike Dr. Sterling? Did you perform an invasive procedure?" Sloane looked at the administrator, then at Sterling. She saw the fear behind the resident's eyes. He knew. He knew he had missed the pneumothorax. He knew he had been seconds away from killing a war hero. And he knew that if Sloane remained employed, she was a walking testament to his incompetence. "The patient had a tension pneumothorax," Sloane said calmly. "Dr. Sterling was treating a neck laceration while the patient suffocated. I performed a needle decompression to save his life." "You are a nurse." Sterling shrieked, his composure shattering. "You don't diagnose. You don't operate. You follow orders. I had it under control." "He was coding, Preston," Sloane said softly. "Enough." Henderson barked. He looked at Sloane with a mixture of disbelief and bureaucratic finality. "Ms. Avery, the hierarchy of this hospital exists for a reason. You have admitted to assaulting a superior and performing unauthorized surgery. The outcome is irrelevant to the liability you have created." He held out his hand. "Your badge. Now." Sloane felt a hollow ache in her chest, the familiar weight of injustice she had carried since her discharge. Slowly, she unclipped the plastic ID card from her scrub top. It was a flimsy piece of plastic, but it was the key to her pension. It was the key to her quiet life. She dropped it into Henderson's palm. "You are terminated for cause effective immediately," Henderson stated, clipping the words. "We will be reporting this incident to the nursing board. You can expect your license to be suspended pending an investigation. And if Dr. Sterling chooses to press charges for assault, we will cooperate fully with the police." "Get her off the property," Sterling sneered, finally regaining his posture now that the threat was neutralized. "And check her pockets. Make sure she didn't steal any narcotics on her way out." The insult was petty, small, and unworthy of a response. Sloane turned around. The security guards tightened their grip, escorting her toward the employee exit like a common criminal. As she walked down the long, bright corridor, the hospital staff stopped to watch. She saw Brittany peering out from a supply closet, hand over her mouth. She saw Dr. Cole shaking his head, already rewriting the story in his mind to align with the victor. They didn't see a hero. They saw a cautionary tale. A crazy old woman who snapped. They reached the rear exit. The guard pushed the door open, and the humid, heavy air of the Virginia afternoon hit Sloane like a physical wall. "Don't come back, Avery," the guard muttered, giving her a final shove onto the concrete loading dock. Next time you leave in handcuffs. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the electronic lock engaging with a final, decisive clunk. Sloane stood alone on the loading dock. She was jobless. Her career was likely over. The pension she had suffered for was gone. She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump of the combat override. She walked down the metal stairs to the asphalt. She didn't have her purse. She didn't have her coat. She only had the scrubs on her back and the echo of the flatline turning into a rhythm. She thought she was walking away into obscurity, back to the nothingness she craved. She thought the story ended here. But she didn't know that inside Trauma Bay 1, Major Julian Blackwood was fighting his way back to consciousness, and the first word he rasped to the hovering general wasn't about his mission, or his pain. It was a description of a woman with gray hair and the hands of a killer. The city bus smelled of wet wool, diesel fumes, and the hopeless dampness of a Virginia thunderstorm. Sloane Avery sat in the very last row, squeezed into the corner seat, vibrating with the rattle of the idling engine. On her lap sat a soggy cardboard box, the universal trophy of the terminated employee. It had been a final, petty indignity. After the loading dock, the security guard had marched her back inside through a side entrance, standing over her while she emptied her locker. He had watched her with suspicion as she packed her spare pair of socks, a chipped ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," and the cheap stethoscope she had bought at a pharmacy. He had checked the pockets of her coat for stolen drugs before tossing it at her. Then he had walked her to the front door, ensuring the receptionists and patients saw her shame. Now she was just another ghost on the transit line. Rain lashed against the bus windows, turning the passing streetlights into smeared streaks of red and yellow. Sloane stared through the glass, but she didn't see the city. She saw the needle popping through the chest wall. She felt the hiss of the air escaping. She saw the color returning to Major Blackwood's face. She had done the right thing. In the moral calculus of the battlefield, she had scored a victory. But the civilian world didn't run on moral calculus. It ran on liability and ego. She had saved a life, and the cost was her own survival. She shifted the box on her lap, her fingers brushing against the stethoscope. The pension. That was the real loss. She had endured 3 years of humiliation, of being called grandma and janitor, just to reach the finish line that would grant her a meager monthly check in health insurance. She needed that insurance. The shrapnel still lodged near her lumbar spine wasn't going to extract itself, and the therapy for the night terrors wasn't free. Ticket check. The driver bellowed from the front, his voice distorted by the static of the intercom. Sloane ignored him. She had paid her fare. She pulled her coat tighter, trying to disappear into the fabric. She was good at disappearing. It was how she had survived the drawdown after the war. But the anger was bubbling up now, a hot, corrosive acid in her gut. She pictured Dr. Sterling's face, the smooth, unblemished skin of a man who had never had to dig a grave for a friend. He would go on to be chief of surgery. He would tell the story of the crazy nurse at cocktail parties. And Major Blackwood? He would be transferred to Walter Reed, and he would never know that the woman who saved him was currently shivering on a bus headed for a studio apartment with a leaking roof. The bus lurched forward, swaying through the heavy traffic. A teenager 2 rows up was blasting music through headphones, the tinny beat syncing with the throbbing in Sloane's knee. A woman across the aisle held a crying baby, looking at Sloane with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "I am not a victim," Sloane told herself, gripping the cardboard box until the edges crumpled. "I am a lieutenant colonel. I am a Silver Star recipient." But those titles didn't exist here. Here, she was just an unemployed 52-year-old woman with shaky hands and a black mark on her record that would ensure she never worked in medicine again. She would have to move. Maybe go back to the Midwest. Find a job stocking shelves at a grocery store where the most dangerous thing she faced was a falling can of peas. The bus turned onto 4th Street, a long stretch of road flanked by government buildings and industrial parks. The traffic was usually light here, but the bus suddenly decelerated, the air brakes hissing violently. Sloane jolted forward, catching the box before it slid to the floor. The driver slammed on the brakes, throwing the standing passengers off balance. "Hey, watch it," someone yelled. "Roadblock," the driver grunted, peering through the rain-slicked windshield. "Crazy. Cop cars everywhere." Sloane felt a prickle on the back of her neck. It was the same sensation she used to get when the hairs on her arms stood up right before an ambush. The spidey sense. She wiped the condensation from the window and looked out. It wasn't cops. Ahead of the bus, 3 black SUVs were parked in a phalanx formation, blocking both lanes of traffic. Their lights weren't flashing red and blue. They were flashing strobe white. The bus driver opened the door, ready to yell at the obstruction, but he froze. Men were stepping out of the vehicles. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They were wearing tactical gear, subdued colors, and drop-leg holsters. They moved with a synchronized, fluid lethality that Sloane recognized instantly. She shrank back into her seat, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They found me. But it didn't make sense. Sterling was petty, but he wasn't powerful enough to call in a federal tactical team. Unless the major had died. Unless they were charging her with manslaughter. The lead SUV door opened and a figure stepped out into the rain. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a trench coat over a dress uniform. Even from this distance, through the blur of the rain and the dirty glass, Sloane saw the glint of stars on his shoulder. The bus driver's voice trembled over the intercom. Folks, nobody move." The general didn't look at the driver. He didn't look at the traffic. He walked straight toward the bus, his eyes scanning the windows until they locked onto the back row. Sloane stopped breathing. She knew that walk. She knew that face. And as General Mitchell stepped onto the bus, bringing the smell of rain and authority with him, Sloane realized that the box in her lap wasn't just a collection of junk. It was the only shield she had left against the past she had tried so hard to bury. The silence on the bus was absolute, heavier than the humidity clinging to the windows. Even the teenager with the headphones had pulled them down, the tinny trap beat silenced by the sudden, overwhelming presence of state power. Outside, the three black SUVs sat like monoliths in the rain, their strobe lights cutting through the gloom with blinding, rhythmic flashes of white. The bus driver, a man whose authority usually began and ended with the fare box, stood up. He looked ready to shout, to demand an explanation for the blockade that had thrown his schedule into chaos. But the words died in his throat as the pneumatic doors hissed open. General Marcus Mitchell did not climb the steps. He ascended them. He wore his Army service uniform under a black trench coat that was slick with rain, the water beating on the fabric like mercury. He didn't look at the driver. He didn't look at the fare box. He stepped onto the rubber matting of the aisle with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. "Sir, you can't just—" the driver started, his voice cracking. Mitchell turned his head slightly. It wasn't a glare, it was a dismissal. He simply ceased to acknowledge the driver's existence. Two men in tactical gear stepped up behind the general, effectively sealing the exit. They didn't draw their weapons, but their hands rested on their chests, near the hidden holsters beneath their jackets. They scanned the passengers with cold, predatory eyes, analyzing threats, sorting wolves from sheep. Sloane Avery sank deeper into the corner of the back row. She clutched the soggy cardboard box to her chest like a shield. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that defied her training. She had spent 3 years erasing herself. She had become gray, quiet, and invisible. She had endured the insults of children like Preston Sterling just to stay off the grid. But gravity always wins. Mitchell began to walk down the aisle. The passengers shrank back as he passed. The young mother with the baby pressed herself against the window, shielding the infant's face. The businessman in the cheap suit looked down at his shoes, terrified of making eye contact. To them, this wasn't a rescue, it was a raid. They were wondering who among them was a terrorist, a spy, or a fugitive. Sloane watched him come. He hadn't changed much in 5 years. His hair was silver now, cut in the same severe high and tight. His face was a map of hard decisions, etched with lines that only deepened when he frowned. He walked with a slight limp, shrapnel from a jagged ridgeline in the Korangal Valley, but he hid it well. He stopped 3 rows from the back. He didn't scan the crowd. He didn't need to. He looked directly at the woman in the oversized scrubs, huddled in the corner with a box of trash on her lap. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. "You're hard to find, Sloane," Mitchell said. His voice was deep, gravel over iron, carrying easily to the back of the bus. Sloane didn't stand. She couldn't. Her legs felt like lead. "I wasn't hiding, General. I was retired." "There is no retirement for people like us," Mitchell replied, taking another step. "There is only redeployment." The passengers turned, their necks craning. They looked from the imposing general to the janitor in the back row. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. They couldn't reconcile the image of the trembling, gray-haired woman with the reverence in the general's tone. "I didn't kill him, Marcus," Sloane said softly, using his first name. The breach of protocol made the tactical officers at the front of the bus stiffen, but Mitchell didn't flinch. "I know," Mitchell said. "I read the report from the MPs. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression. Textbook execution. He paused, his eyes drifting to the cardboard box on her lap. Though I imagine the hospital administration didn't see it that way. They fired me, Sloane said, a bitter smile touching her lips. Gross misconduct. Assault. I'm waiting for the police to haul me in. Mitchell finally reached the back row. He towered over her, blocking out the light from the front of the bus. He looked down at the box, at the chipped mug, the cheap stethoscope, the pair of spare socks. He looked at the trembling hands that had saved his best officer. The police aren't coming, Mitchell said. And you aren't fired. You're being reactivated. Sloane blinked. Reactivated? I'm a civilian. I have a pension. Your pension is secure, Mitchell interrupted. But right now my unit is in that hospital. My commander is alive because of you, and he is currently waking up in a recovery room surrounded by wolves who are trying to rewrite history to save their own careers. He extended a hand. It was a gloved hand, steady and commanding. Major Blackwood is asking for the ghost medic, Mitchell said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with significance. And I don't intend to tell him she was kicked off the premises by a boy with a god complex. Sloane looked at the hand. Then she looked at the box. The symbol of her submission. The symbol of her silence. I have nothing left there, General, she whispered. They took my badge. They took my dignity. Then let's go get them back, Mitchell said. Leave the box, Colonel. You won't need it where we're going. Sloane hesitated for a heartbeat. Then she set the cardboard box on the empty seat next to her. She stood up. Her back straightened. The slump of the tired janitor vanished, replaced by the steel spine of an officer. She took the general's hand, not for support, but in a handshake that sealed a pact. As Mitchell turned and led her back down the aisle, the passengers stared in open-mouthed shock. The crazy lady was gone. In her place walked a woman who moved with the same predatory grace as the soldiers guarding the door. They stepped off the bus and into the rain. The cool air felt like baptism. One of the tactical officers opened the rear door of the lead SUV. Where are we going? Sloane asked, pausing as the rain plastered her gray hair to her forehead. Mitchell smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that promised retribution. Back to the scene of the crime. Major Blackwood is awake and he has a statement to make. But before that, there is a dossier in this car that you need to see. It seems Dr. Sterling has been hiding a lot more than just his incompetence. The return to St. Jude's was not an entrance. It was an invasion. When General Mitchell swept through the automatic glass doors of the main lobby, he didn't stop at the reception desk. He walked past the startled security guards with a stride that consumed the floor, flanked by 2 tactical officers and Sloane Avery. The wet scrubs still clung to her frame, and her hair was plastered to her forehead, but something fundamental had shifted in the air around her. She wasn't walking behind the general, she was walking beside him. The hush that fell over the lobby was immediate. Nurses stopped mid-conversation. An orderly dropped a stack of files. They watched, wide-eyed, as the crazy janitor, who had been escorted out 30 minutes ago, returned with the full weight of the United States military at her back. They didn't take the elevator. Mitchell marched straight to the administrative suite on the first floor, the heels of his dress shoes cracking against the terrazzo like pistol shots. He reached the heavy oak door marked Administrator Eugene Henderson and didn't bother to knock. He simply opened it. Inside, the atmosphere was one of self-congratulatory relief. Mr. Henderson was behind his desk, typing furiously on a laptop. Dr. Preston Sterling was pacing the room, a Scotch glass in his hand, looking like a man who had just dodged a bullet and was already writing the victory speech. I'm telling you, Gary, Sterling was saying, gesturing with the glass. We frame it as a mental health crisis. We say she was delusional, suffering from elderly onset psychosis. We protect the hospital's reputation, and I come out looking like I managed a volatile situation. Is that the official statement, Doctor? The voice cut through the room like a serrated blade. Sterling spun around, the scotch splashing onto his hand. Henderson jumped in his chair, his glasses sliding down his nose. General Mitchell stood in the doorway, filling the frame. Sloane stood just behind his right shoulder, her face an impassive mask. General, Henderson stammered, standing up so quickly his chair tipped over. We weren't expecting you. I was just preparing the incident report regarding the regrettable situation with... The situation with Lieutenant Colonel Avery? Mitchell interrupted, stepping into the room. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sterling blinked, his brain misfiring as it tried to process the words. Lieutenant, what? Mitchell didn't answer him. He walked to Henderson's desk and dropped a thick manila folder onto the polished wood. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that sounded like a gavel. "I pulled her service record from the Pentagon archives on the way here," Mitchell said, his voice deceptively calm. "Since your HR department seems to have lost the ability to read, I thought I'd help you update your files." Henderson reached out with a trembling hand and opened the dossier. The first page wasn't a resume. It was a citation. "Read it," Mitchell commanded. Out loud. Henderson swallowed hard. He looked at the paper, then at Sloan, then back at the paper. "Awarded to Captain Sloan Avery for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action." His voice faltered. "Keep reading," Mitchell said. "While serving as lead triage officer during the siege of..." Henderson stopped, his face draining of color. He looked up at Sterling, his eyes wide with horror. "She has a silver star." Sterling let out a scoff, though it sounded weak. "That's impossible. She's a nurse. She shakes when she holds a cup of coffee." Mitchell turned to Sterling. The movement was slow, predatory. "She shakes, Dr. Sterling, because of the nerve damage she sustained while shielding 3 wounded Marines from a secondary IED blast. She holds that cup of coffee with a hand that has performed more field surgeries in the back of a burning Humvee than you have performed in your entire sterile, air-conditioned career." Mitchell reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, black and white, taken in a desert triage tent. It showed a younger Sloan, covered in dust and blood, working on a soldier with a focused, terrifying intensity. "They call her the ghost medic," Mitchell said, his voice lowering to a rumble. "Because in the special operations community, she is the one you pray for when you are bleeding out in the dark. She doesn't exist on paper. She doesn't give interviews. She just saves lives that God himself had given up on." Sterling backed up until his legs hit the leather sofa. He looked at Sloan, really looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see the janitor anymore. He saw the predator that had thrown him across the trauma bay. The realization of what he had done, who he had humiliated, crashed over him like a wave of ice water. I didn't know," Sterling whispered. "Ignorance is not a defense," Mitchell snapped. "You belittled a superior officer. You endangered a high-value asset due to your own ego. And you fired the only person in this building who knew how to save my commander." Mitchell snatched the badge, Sloan's plastic ID card, off Henderson's desk. He turned and pressed it into Sloan's hand. "You don't work for them anymore, Colonel," Mitchell said softly. "But you have 1 patient left to discharge." Sloan looked at the badge, then at the terrified men in the office. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply pocketed the card and turned back to the door. "Come on," Mitchell said, opening the door for her. "Major Blackwood is awake. He's refusing to let anyone touch his chest tube until he speaks to the officer who put it there. And unlike these gentlemen, he knows exactly who he's saluting." The double doors of the trauma unit swung open, but this time the atmosphere was not one of chaotic urgency. It was a cathedral-like silence. Sloan Avery walked back into the world that had rejected her, her footsteps syncing perfectly with the heavy, ominous tread of General Mitchell. Behind them, Dr. Sterling trailed like a condemned man walking to the gallows, his face a pale mask of dread. The staff of St. Jude's had gathered. News of the general's arrival, and the revelation in the administrator's office, had moved through the hospital faster than a virus. Nurses who had giggled at Sloan's plodding pace now stared at her with wide, re-evaluating eyes. Dr. Cole stood by the nursing station, holding a clipboard that he seemed to have forgotten he was holding. He looked at Sloan, then at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the woman he had mocked only an hour before. Sloan didn't look at them. Her focus was laser-locked on Trauma Bay 1. Through the glass wall she saw him. Major Julian Blackwood was no longer the thrashing, dying animal on the table. He was sitting up on the edge of the bed, his massive frame draped in a hospital gown that looked absurdly small on him. His chest was wrapped in thick bandages, a clear tube protruding from his left side, the chest tube that had replaced Sloan's needle. 2 nurses were fluttering around him, trying to coax him back into a supine position. He brushed them away with a gentle but immovable force. He was scanning the room, his eyes dark and alert, searching for something the doctors couldn't provide. When he saw Sloan, the searching stopped. General Mitchell stepped back, giving Sloan the lane. She walked to the doorway and stopped. "Major," she said softly. Julian Blackwood froze. He looked at the gray hair, the oversized scrubs, the shaking hands that hung at her sides. He didn't see a grandmother. He saw the operator who had reached into the dark and pulled him back. "They told me a janitor saved my life," Julian rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. But I told them a janitor doesn't know where the second intercostal space is. He placed his hands on the mattress. The muscles in his forearms bunched like steel cables. Sir, please, one of the nurses pleaded, reaching for his arm. You need to lie down. Your blood pressure. Stand down, Julian ordered, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute command. The nurse recoiled as if stung. With a groan that he swallowed behind clenched teeth, Major Blackwood pushed himself off the bed. His legs shook. The pain in his chest must have been blinding, a hot iron searing through his ribs with every breath. But he stood. He stood to his full height, towering over the equipment, a broken titan refusing to crumble. Sloane watched him, her own posture shifting. She was no longer the employee. She was the officer. She snapped her heels together, her spine stiffening into the position of attention she hadn't held in years. Julian took a breath, fighting the agony, and slowly, deliberately raised his right hand. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was perfect. A crisp, unwavering salute that cut through the sterile air of the hospital and honored the warrior standing in the cheap scrubs. Lieutenant Colonel, Julian said. Thank you. Sloane raised her hand. The tremor was gone. Her salute was sharp, precise, and immediate. Major. The room held its breath. It was a moment of pure, crystallized vindication. The hierarchy of the hospital, the degrees, the titles, the egos, dissolved in the face of a code they couldn't comprehend. Get him out, Mitchell's voice broke the spell. He wasn't looking at the major. He was pointing a gloved finger at Dr. Sterling, who was hovering near the entrance, looking sick. Two MPs stepped out of the shadows. They didn't ask Sterling to leave. They grabbed him by the arms of his pristine white coat. This is a mistake. Sterling stammered, his voice rising in panic as they dragged him backward. I am the chief resident. You can't do this. I have rounds. Your rounds are finished, doctor, Mitchell said coldly. And so is your license. The board has already been notified of your negligence. Sterling's protests were cut off as the doors swung shut, dragging him out into the rain-slicked afternoon, leaving only the echo of his entitlement behind. Sloane lowered her hand. Julian sank back onto the bed, exhausted but smiling. The connection between them was forged in iron. We have a transport waiting at the airfield, Mitchell said, stepping up beside Sloane. The major is being moved to Walter Reed. He wants you on the flight to oversee his transfer. I'm not on the payroll, General, Sloane said, glancing at the badge in her pocket. No, Mitchell agreed, reaching into his trench coat. He pulled out a black envelope sealed with wax. You're not on their payroll anymore. He handed her the envelope. It was heavy. The study guides can wait, Sloane. We have a new problem. A situation in the Black Sea that requires someone who knows how to be invisible. Mitchell's eyes locked onto hers. We don't need a nurse. We need the ghost. Are you in? A dying Navy SEAL with a chest tube ripped through his ribs forced himself to stand up and salute this woman. He gave everything he had just to say, thank you. If a half-dead soldier can stand up for her, you can take 1 second to hit subscribe. Don't let this story die in the dark. Like the video if you respect the ghost medic and tell me in the comments. Would you have broken protocol to save him?